Hi everyone, I'm Gary Knoll. For those of you who have not seen our program before, each and every week at this time we're here to share information on how to improve the quality of your health. Now there are a lot of programs on health and a lot of useful programs. Some deal with aerobics and some deal with light nutritional issues. Some deal with behavior. We tend to take on the more serious issues. We do a lot of investigative reporting. We break a lot of stories exclusively for the first time, when they can still make a difference. Stories about our environment and how it's becoming polluted. Stories about what goes into our food supply and how it can undermine our well-being. We also expose those practices in medicine that are not necessary, not safe, and not effective, as well as promoting those that are effective and at the cutting edge of new sciences. Today on our program, we're going to be doing an investigation into a topic that affects hundreds of thousands of people. The following claim is being made by my guest, that 3 Mile Island, which we were told caused no death, no damage, in point of fact led to almost 50,000 Americans dying, that this information was well known by our governmental agencies and suppressed, that documents that could prove this were altered. Not only that, but that Chernobyl led to almost 30,000 to 40,000 deaths. Again, we knew it. It was kept from the American public. Dr. Ernest Sterglass is Professor Emeritus from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School. His background is in nuclear physics and science. And Dr. Gould, whose research background in computer databases helped blow the lid off this entire story. Unfortunately, these people have not had their information accepted yet. We hope that by exposing this on our program today, that you can start making some effort to bring this to the attention of the appropriate authorities and get it out of the closet. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. You've made some very serious allegations. You've alleged that 50,000 Americans died because of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. Put together, we're talking almost 80,000 to 90,000 deaths, and that many more may die as a subsequent because of the subsequent exposure over 10, 20 years from low-level radiation. Now, prove your case. Let's begin with Dr. Gould.
Yes, well, I am a statistician, and I have had the opportunity to examine the mortality changes associated with each of these large radiation releases. Beginning with the Chernobyl release, we now know that the radiation, low-level radiation, or the fission products from the Chernobyl cloud arrived in the United States around about May 9th, about 10 days after the accident in the Soviet Union, and came down in the rain over many parts of the United States, particularly those with heavy rainfall in the middle of May 1986, and was associated with an immediate increase in mortality among many sectors of the population.
Who?
Well, it affected particularly the very young, the very old, and those who had vulnerable immune systems from, say, if they were suffering from infectious diseases. As an example, AIDS-related deaths in the month of May 1986 doubled over the comparable figure of May 1985, indicating that the fission products that came from the Chernobyl cloud affected the immune systems of people who did have some damage or had some immune deficiency. This is the result of a biochemical mechanism that Dr. Sterglass can talk about in great detail. As a statistician, however, I can attest to the fact that the mortality changes we're talking about, both in the case of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, have a probability value of being due to chance that is infinitesimal. In other words, if fission products from Chernobyl or fission products from 3 Mile Island did not account for this enormous increase in what statisticians call a significant increase in mortality, then some other hypothesis would have to be invoked to explain these extraordinary events.
All right, now that's Chernobyl. We knew that clouds could be dangerous. We knew it was floating over different parts of the world. We knew that, for instance, the reindeer and other population animal groups in the Nordic area were polluted, and even farm food was banned. We didn't think that it would affect us here, and we were told that it wouldn't affect us.
Right.
Let's shift now to 3 Mile Island. You claim that upwards of 50,000 Americans, 50,000, died because of the after effects on the immune systems of weakened people, elderly people, people in nursing homes, people in hospitals, the young.
Very young, fetuses.
Over how long a
particularly.
period?
Well, the impact, the immune system impact came almost immediately. And in the case of the 3 Mile Island accident, for example, which occurred at the end of March of 1979, the increase in infant mortality came within 3 months and was particularly centered in the states of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and up in New York State, which is where the wind and rainfall affected areas to a greater degree than, say, areas that were 1,000 miles away.
To make these claims, the audience has to assume that you're not just a bunch of crackpots trying to get some media attention. But if you were crackpots and making these claims, you could get some media attention. We'd like to know something about your background. I know it. I want our audience to know it so that they can see something more about who you are. Dr. Gould?
Very well. I'm a database statistician. I was on the Science Advisory Board of EPA and the Carter administration. I'm responsible for a good deal of statistical measurements of toxic concentrations of toxic waste. And in recent years, I've turned my attention to the problem of low-level radiation. I'm the author of several books, and our findings on Chernobyl has been the subject of a recent publication by the American Chemical Society in its magazine called Chemtech. And all of the figures and charts involved in that investigation have been published and have been exposed to a peer review on the part of scientists, except for the fact that the news that the message that we're carrying is so painful to many members of the scientific establishment that to this date it has been largely ignored.
All right, and you're also with a foundation?
Yes, I am the principal investigator of the Radiation and Public Health Research Project, which is sponsored by the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ. And as a nonprofit investigation, we get funds from various foundations to continue our research.
All right. Dr. Ernest Sterglass, first a little background about yourself as both a scientist and a physician.
Well, actually, I'm a medical physicist. Since 1967, I've been at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Medicine in the Department of Radiology, where I was in charge of a laboratory developing new kinds of cameras and new types of instruments for radiology, for better imaging at lower doses. In fact, since 1952, I have been working on the whole task of minimizing the effect of X-rays and maximizing the benefit from the necessary radiation, which we do have to use because X-rays are still one of the most powerful and valuable diagnostic tools. So I've been working in instrumentation for nuclear medicine and radiology for the last 35 years.
How many papers in the scientific peer-reviewed journals have you published?
I would say I published over 150 papers and a number of books on review papers in the whole field.
Are you a member of different scientific advisory boards?
Yes, I was on the board in diagnostic radiology imaging of the American Association of Physicists in Medicine. I was elected as a fellow of the American Physical Society, and I was elected to numerous organizations, including the Health Physics Society and the Radiological Society of North America, and I've served and testified before the Atomic Energy Commission, the Joint Committee in Congress in 1963, and hearings on doses, permissible doses to the public from radiation.
All right. I want this as background, just so the audience can understand that to make the statement you're making, that 50,000 people died and this was covered up by our government, that you're not two crackpots out there, that you both have credibility and a long history of being members of the very scientific community that you're now challenging.
That's right.
All right, now to the specific issues.
Right. Well,
First of all, prove your point that the government covered up this information.
I'll give you an example. This appeared in our article, which was reviewed, and it's public knowledge. This is data on the number of infants that died every month in 1986 compared with the same month in the previous year. Published in the U.S. Monthly Vital Statistics, available in any library in the country. And anyone can go and duplicate this data. And they will find that suddenly in June, when normally infant mortality is lowest, there was this gigantic peak of about 30% on the Atlantic coast and 60% increase in infant mortality on the West Coast. And this is all out of published government statistics. But we discovered that when we looked at the same data the following year, when a revised version is issued, they publish it 3 successive years, and each time they have an opportunity to make small corrections, clerical errors, printing errors. We found that there was a gigantic reduction in California, but not in the South Atlantic and not for many other states, so it was designed to minimize the infant mortality impact on the United States. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that we must not have the public understand how serious the fallout from nuclear weapons is that are dropped, say, on China or Germany or Russia or wherever, and drift back because the fallout comes back to us and comes down in a matter of a week after a detonation. And therefore, the government has for decades a well-documented record of covering up the serious effects of small amounts of fallout that was uncovered by the Washington Post. Bill Curry in April of 1979 published an article under Freedom of Information. They obtained the evidence that the government own studies, some carried out by Dr. Edward Weiss in the Public Health Service, showed that as early as 1960, 61, 62, there were increases in leukemia in Utah and Nevada and around the test site in the West way before anyone in the public was notified, and in fact, those studies were suppressed. So there's a long record whereby the government felt that it had to suppress this information in the name and the interest of national security.
Let me put this in perspective so I understand this. The United States government has been withholding information from the American public of the dangers of low-level radiation because if the American public found out that there can be no such thing as a reliable deterrent to war using nuclear products, because the byproduct, even if we had first strike,
Exactly.
even if the Russians never fired a missile,
Exactly.
and we were able to destroy every Russian city, we would end up killing our own population because within 1 week, the fallout would cover us and the low-level radiation would kill Americans.
That's right.
So therefore, the American government has been perpetrating a massive fraud in the name of defense. Now, to what degree do you feel that the people who are the primary makers and shakers and the people who benefit from that arms or nuclear power plants or nuclear armamentation have kept that misinformation campaign alive?
May I
Yes, Dr.
comment
Gould.
on that? I recently had the opportunity to read carefully The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, a very good book on the entire history. And to my amazement, I found a page in which 1943, Rhodes relates that Enrico Fermi came to Oppenheimer, who was then heading the project, and said, in the event we don't complete the fission bomb in time, I am generating a lot of strontium-90 in my reactor pile. Why don't we consider that if we don't have the bomb, that we simply scatter the strontium-90 over the German landmass? We'll kill as many Germans as we want. And Rhodes relates that Oppenheimer then discusses it with Teller, and Teller agrees that this would kill as many people, as many persons as we want, by food poisoning. And they even knew at that time that the strontium-90 would get into the bone marrow and affect the immune systems. So this debate really goes back to 1943. The government has known all this time of the biochemical mechanism by which strontium-90, as one of the isotopes, radioactive isotopes that would damage the immune systems, was a perfectly available system of poisoning as many people as anyone would want.
As a matter of fact, this was called radiological warfare. And for that reason, all information on radioactivity in the environment, on radioactivity from fallout, the health effects on the beagle dogs that were tested at Argonne National Laboratories, the report of which I heard 25 years later at a meeting at which I presented my findings, all this was regarded as part of a weapon system that was just or more effective than any chemical poison gas that we had ever developed. But it was enormously important to our military never to have nuclear weapons identified as biological weapons. And yet, that is what they are. They are the most toxic biological weapons that man has ever invented, just for the same reason that a tiny pellet of uranium can power New York City for a whole week. For the same reason, a tiny pellet of that waste can destroy 1 million to 1 billion times as many molecules as the same amount of any ordinary pollutant. Mercury, lead, any of the pesticides, gram for gram, radioactive poisons were recognized by Fermi and Oppenheimer as long as 1944-45 as billions of times more toxic than any other poison known to man.
So we've been living with a massive fraud that has caused a lot of Americans to develop cancer because we have had fallout from our own above-ground test, and even the pollution from nuclear power plants and that were called safe, and some of the leaks from those that we were told would not harm us,
Exactly.
have been going over our land. They're caught into the clouds. They could go thousands of miles. They fall from in the rain into the soil. They get into the soil. The cattle eat the soil, ends up in the milk of the cows. The mothers then feed their babies or themselves or children this, and that's why we have higher incidence of diseases now in children than we ever had earlier.
Sure.
In these types of diseases we have no explanation for. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Furthermore, the amounts that are required are so small, they absolutely blow your mind. It turns out that only about a few thousand atoms of iodine-131, which is created in the fission process, is enough to poison a quart of milk to the level that we had during the time of 3 Mile Island in Chernobyl. And to show that this is, in fact, a causal agent, Dr. Gould and I published this following graph, which appeared in this journal earlier. And you can see here a plot of the percent increase in cancer rates, in total mortality due to all causes, not just cancer, across the United States, all the way from the places where very little rainfall occurred in the southwest, all the way to the top, which occurred in the West Coast, especially Oregon and
Washington
State and California. And you see that with a measured amount of iodine in the milk, reported by the EPA in its official reports, every quarter they publish these numbers. All we did is to put these numbers down on a graph and compared the change in mortality over the previous few years compared to what happened that summer, the deadly summer of '86.
So what you're saying then is that when that cloud was released from 3 Mile Island, it spread over hundreds and hundreds of miles.
500 miles.
500 miles. And that ended up in the soil, it ended up in the air, and anyone who had a compromised immune system was creating enormous free radicals, and other biochemical changes within the
Body.
DNA and of the cell.
Not the DNA,
The cell membranes
Cell
are
membrane,
damaged,
yeah.
and especially the ones in the bone marrow, where, of course, most of
B
our
cells.
cells originate.
It's part of our immune system.
Precisely. And in fact, by animal studies had shown years ago that a small amount of strontium-90 or strontium-89 introduced into the bone marrow of an animal, a rat, absolutely kills the natural killer cell activity, the front line of our defense against infections and against cancer cells. And that aspect was completely kept secret by our government. All our present regulations are based on the production of cancer cells, not on how radiation affects the immune system, which is sort of the police of our body, which keeps these cancer cells under control. And as a result, the physical situation is that when the immune system is damaged, as it is in the case of an AIDS patient, they develop cancer much more quickly and much more readily than a normal person does. And that is what we had totally overlooked. And all this was only discovered in the last 15 or 20 years. But this information has not been considered in the setting of government standards for how much radioactivity we can have in our milk and in our food.
Would you imagine that part of the reason that they're not taking the strontium out of the milk completely is because there's no milk in America that would have strontium-free milk?
That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, during the time of the height of nuclear bomb testing, techniques were developed by methods of ion exchange to remove the strontium-90 in case nuclear weapons testing should continue. As it turned out, we ended nuclear bomb testing in the atmosphere in 1963, but the permissible radiation standards had been set high enough so that every nuclear plant was designed to meet those standards. So around nuclear plants in New York and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, the local milk was and is still being subjected to emissions which are regarded as totally harmless. Strontium-90 at a few picocurie, a few trillionths of a curie per liter, was regarded as producing less than thousandths of the natural background radiation. And we could not believe that these tiny amounts of radiation could produce such serious effects.
All right, now let's focus on this part of the problem. In the American public's mind, they perceive nuclear problems if there is the big blast.
That's right.
They see the mushroom cloud, that's when they panic. We have never been conditioned to accept that low levels could be more harmful to more people than the big blast.
Exactly
Explain the difference between the two dynamics.
Right.
And then lastly, tie in the association of the armament for nuclear arsenal, the fact that we have about enough kill capacity right now to kill every man, woman, and child 32,000 times, and therefore why the justification of continuing to spend all these billions of dollars on producing more when you can already kill everyone in the world, every human being on the planet 32,000 times. Why kill them 33,000 times? Kill them once and they're dead.
Well, I think the main point is that
I mean, at some point, Americans have to wake up and realize that an enormous amount of money is being spent that could be better spent on programs that help people,
absolutely,
not kill people.
But you see, the bomb was developed at a time when people were focusing on the blast effect, on the fire effect, and nobody talked about the radiological effect, the effect on human health. And thousands of miles away from a bomb blast was poo-pooed. The military didn't want this to be known. They didn't want this to become a biological weapon which the public would revolt against. And so all reference to it as a biological weapon was just kept out of the public, and everything was classified. Now, the reason why low-level radiation from fallout is so much more damaging than we even dreamt of 40 years ago when the bomb was developed is that a new mechanism was discovered, a biological mechanism that we did not appreciate fully. And that was discovered by a Canadian scientist by the name of Dr. Abram Petkow, oddly enough working for the Canadian Atomic Energy Commission in Pinawa, Manitoba. And he discovered that when he took a cell membrane and put it into a vial of water and put an X-ray tube on it, an X-ray machine, it would take thousands of rads to break the membrane. But when he added a little radioactive salt, a tiny amount, he found that less than 1 rad would break the membrane after a few hours. And when he discovered that, and then extended his experiments, he found that free radicals, the ordinary oxygen that we need for life, became as toxic as ozone. It became negatively charged and was attracted to the cell membranes and dissolved the cell membrane in a chain reaction, so that a single free radical oxygen molecule could go over to the cell membrane and puncture it like a balloon. Now, how many needles do you need to puncture a balloon? Obviously, throwing 1,000 needles at a balloon is totally unnecessary. 1 needle will do it. And so it turns out that the oxygen-free radicals, at very low concentration, 1 needle at a time, can puncture all these cells in the immune system and produce devastating results at doses 1,000 to 10,000 times lower than we had ever experienced or extrapolated from our experience at Hiroshima or 3/4 of a century of medical experience with medical X-rays.
There's one interesting statistical fact to back this up. Infant mortality rates in this country have been improving for centuries, and certainly for the first 5 decades of the 20th century. Yet all the official figures show that in the 50s, infant mortality flattened out for a period of nearly 10 years and only started to resume its downward improvement after the test ban was signed in 1963. So you have to consider what force of mortality eliminated the improvement over these years. And then you have to ask yourself the following question. Obviously, many babies did not survive in those years that should have survived. But then what about those who did survive? They may have had immune damage, which is now only emerging today, when we find that young people particularly now suffer from an entire range of infectious diseases that were completely unknown before World War II.
Thank you all very much. That's our program. I hope that you appreciate what it is that we're dealing with. A very serious issue, an issue of life and death. I'm Gary Null, Dr. Ernest Sterglass, Dr. Jay Gould, my guest. See you next week.